1066, Hastings. A battlefield of mud and iron decided who would speak in courts and who would write the laws that governed millions. In the south of England, autumn of that year, a duke from across the Channel landed with ships and acclaim and left with the crown. The story we will tell is not the parade of coronations and banners you think you know. It is a close look at the hidden lives, the counselors in dimly lit chambers, the clerks who drafted orders, the nurses and local reeves who carried news, and the reluctant nobles whose signatures changed what a king could do. In the next 20 minutes, you will see how private choices, corrupted loyalties, and sudden deaths remade institutions and left traces in laws still echoed in parliaments today. How did the everyday routines of households and chancery offices shape the English monarchy that later generations accepted or rejected? We will answer that by tracing origins, external shocks, dynastic turns, institutional reforms, and long-term consequences. Based on chronicles, court rolls, and archival scholarship, this is an account that privileges documents but listens to the sounds and smells of medieval halls. At stake are not only crowns, but the lives of commoners, merchants, and clerics who bore the consequences. By the end, you will understand why a king's private quarrel could become a constitutional precedent for a nation. Before we follow specific reigns, we must look to the roots of what became England. 5th century, eastern coastline. Germanic-speaking groups crossed the North Sea and settled in fragmented polities. By the 9th century, the idea of a single political entity remained fluid. Villages, earldoms, and monasteries carried local memory and legal practice. When we imagine that past, picture narrow lanes slick with animal dung, the metallic smell of early ironworking, and the muffled bell of a wooden church calling the faithful. Language varied from Brythonic on the margins to Old English in the shires. Trade patterns stitched coastal towns to continental markets, while monasteries preserved legal texts and genealogies. Over centuries, these threads knitted a political culture in which personal loyalty bound a suzerain to vassals, and where coronation rights mattered as much as force. Chroniclers like Bede and later William of Malmesbury recorded lineage and piety, often adding moral judgments that shaped later reputations. The exchequer and local reeves kept accounts that reveal how money, not just swords, ran the machinery of rule. It is in these mundane ledgers and in the layout of great halls that the hidden lives of rulers begin to emerge. 1095, Norman courts. External shocks repeatedly forced adaptation. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought new legal forms, new languages in chancery, and new patterns of landholding that reoriented power. The air in Norman halls was heavy with tallow, the clink of coins, and the murmur of translators turning French into English for local stewards. In the 12th and 13th centuries, continental wars, Viking raids, and the volatility of succession tested loyalties. The Black Death of the mid-14th century carried a different kind of shock, a silence in villages where once there had been noise, empty beds, fields untilled, the smell of herbs used in attempts to stave off contagion. The military encounters of the 100 Years' War moved men and money overseas, draining treasuries and elevating tax debates into political crises. Each external shock produced administrative responses. Castles that once symbolized personal authority became fiscal centers. Ports like London, Bristol, and York evolved into hubs whose merchants asserted influence through credit and loans. These external pressures pushed private royal households to rely upon written orders, writs, and bureaucrats whose names rarely appear in grand narratives, but whose actions changed how the crown functioned. 1066, Hastings. Moment of tension 1. The invasion itself is a study in logistics and chance. Imagine a foggy morning along a shoreline, the salt smell thick, boats creaking as men hauled armor into shallow water. Harold Godwinson prepared defenses after a rapid march north. The clash that followed was brutal and sudden. Cavalry and footmen interlocked amid cries and the sharp ring of metal on metal. For William of Normandy, the victory depended as much on timing and the morale of troops as on claim by blood. The immediate result was redistribution of estates and the imposition of feudal tenure that remade local obligations. The social consequences rippled outward. Dispossessed Anglo-Saxon lords, new Norman castellans, and a newly literate chancery copying French legal forms. The battle changed not only who sat on the throne, but who kept records and how oaths were recorded in stone and parchment. 1215. Runnymede. Moment of tension 2. A king under pressure negotiated an unprecedented constraint. The English countryside smelled of spring, cattle lowing near the river, as barons convened with the archbishop and the king. King John faced rebellion after military setbacks and fiscal strain. The result was a set of promises that curbed royal arbitrariness and created a language of rights for free men. The Magna Carta did not create democracy, but it enshrined procedural limits and a mechanism to hold the crown to account. Its clauses, written in blunt Latin and repeated later by scribes in monastic scriptoria, signaled the emergence of a political vocabulary that future parliaments could wield. For local juries and sheriffs, the document altered daily practice. Hearings were formalized, scutage and feudal dues were recorded with greater precision, and the notion that law could bind a king began to be commonplace. 1348. England. Moment of tension 3. The Black Death arrived with a silence that felt like a thief in the night. Villages that in summer had been full of children now stood half empty. The groan of oxen pulling plows was less frequent, and the smell of rotting harvests lingered where labor failed. Mortality rates altered the balance between lords and laborers. Wages rose by necessity, and peasant families found new leverage in negotiating terms of tenure. The crown reacted with ordinances attempting to freeze wages and control mobility, boosting friction between central mandates and local realities. Administrations that had assumed stable incomes now confronted labor scarcity, while the ecclesiastical hierarchy faced funerary overload and a crisis of clerical supply. The demographic shock fed deeper institutional change, prompting reevaluations in taxation, recruitment for war, and the very meaning of service. 1649. London. Moment of tension 4. The trial and execution of a king is a rupture that reverberates across institutions. The courtroom's smell of varnished wood and damp parchment framed arguments about tyranny, consent, and law. Charles I was presented to be judged by commissions gathered from the commons and legal minds who argued the king could be accountable for high crimes. The execution removed the ritual presence of monarchy, replacing it for a time with a republic and the rule of the Council of State. Clerks and soldiers, merchants and rural squires reacted in different ways. Some welcomed a new equity in taxation, others feared the loss of a stabilizing ceremony. The interregnum that followed tested the capacity of assemblies and new administrative organs to replace monarchic symbolism with bureaucratic legitimacies. It is in this absence that the hidden workmanship of governance becomes visible, as committees, committee clerks, and naval administrators take on duties previously associated with personal rule. In the decades after early invasions, dynasties consolidated power through marriage, land grants, and ritual. The Norman and later Plantagenet rulers forged new titles and invented claims linking themselves to older lineages. The court became an instrument of political reproduction. Key figures inhabited these transformations in ways both public and private. William the Conqueror, Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and later Elizabeth I were not only symbols on coins, they were administrators, litigants, spouses, and patrons whose personal choices rippled into law and custom. Institutions like the Curia Regis and the Exchequer emerged to standardize dispute resolution and financial oversight, giving rise to records that modern historians consult. The royal household functioned as a training ground for administrators who carried royal practice into localities. In courts, Latin and, increasingly, Anglo-Norman scribes documented bonds, debts, and pleas that made individual obligations legible to central authorities. This legibility was revolutionary. With it came the possibility of enforcing obligations across distances and generations. 1135 to 1154. Breaks of dynasty and contested successions produced chronic instability. When monarchs die young or without agreed heirs, noble factions responded by raising banners around rival claimants. The anarchy in the middle of the 12th century showed how quickly public order could fragment when competing nobles, abbots, and barons recognized different champions. Towns such as Lincoln and Winchester shifted allegiances based on immediate economic pressures and protection. The church, represented by bishops and abbots, often played a mediating role, but could also be a power broker, as seen when archbishops negotiated oaths of fealty or withheld coronations. Language changed along with allegiance, for administrative documents now negotiated in courts where the king was only one among several litigants. The cultural impact of these breaks included changes in patronage networks, the adoption of continental chivalric norms by native elites, and the introduction of new legal precedents that future compacts would cite. 1154 onward. Institutional transformation took root as monarchs and their councils experimented with law and administration. The invention of writs, the use of itinerant justices, and the development of common procedures moved dispute resolution away from purely local customary practice. The common law began to form as judges traveled, listening to cases, recording decisions, and creating a body of persuasive authority. The exchequer refined accounting practices that allowed for more predictable royal income. One procedural example is the Eyre, a circuit court where royal justices visited counties to hear pleas, collect fines, and assert crown jurisdiction. An Eyre required clerks, known registers, and standardized forms. These processes made governance more codified and allowed the crown to project power through legal mechanisms rather than only through lords or castles. The result was a gradual but profound shift. Authority became as much about paperwork and precedents as about force. The transition from Plantagenets to Tudors marks a central acceleration in state-making. Magna Carta, the Peste Negra, and the wars across the Channel mixed to produce institutional concentration. Two figures in particular illuminate hidden careers that shaped this new order. Henry VII rose from uncertain origins to create a dynasty through marriage, financial acumen, and careful alliances. Born in exile, his childhood entailed years in lodging houses and among Lancastrian retainers. As king, he prioritized fiscal stability, creating officers like the Chamberlain and the Treasurer into instruments of crown policy. He used bonds and recognizances to bind nobles to good behavior, turning private financial obligations into political control. The hidden life here is the royal auditor and the chamber clerk, whose detailed ledgers selected who prospered or sank. Eleanor of Aquitaine offers a contrasting backstory of female agency within dynastic politics. Daughter of a Western duchy, her youth included negotiating ducal succession, patronizing troubadours, and managing estates across vast regions. She married a king and then a duke, and her household served as centers of cultural and political exchange. Her legacy shows how women of high rank navigated marriage, court politics, and patronage to exercise influence behind public ceremonies. Across centuries, secondary actors and institutions repeatedly shaped outcomes. Named actors such as Harold Godwinson, William of Normandy, Henry II, Thomas Becket, Simon de Montfort, Oliver Cromwell, James II, William of Orange appear alongside institutions like the Curia Regis, the Exchequer, the House of Commons, the House of Lords, the Church of England, the Archbishopric of Canterbury, and urban centers such as London and York. Their roles were specific. Harold defended earldoms and rallied levies, William imposed new tenures, Henry II reformed legal practices while facing clerical opposition in Thomas Becket. Simon de Montfort summoned commons to advise on taxation, and Cromwell reorganized administrative machinery during the Republic. Each name and institution is a node in a network that made rulership less personal and more procedural. Along the path from medieval kingship to parliamentary sovereignty, several key moments of tension deserve expanded treatment. The confrontations between Henry II and Thomas Becket involved not only theological disagreement, but the practical control over clerical courts and the issue of sanctuary. The clash of rituals and jurisdiction played out in cathedral echoes, the smell of incense, and the scratch of quills as charters were drawn to clarify rights. Another tense sequence occurred during the Wars of the Roses, where loyalties shifted in weeks. Banners were a visual code in marketplaces and fields, and the fate of a noble house often turned on who arrived first with retinues. The Glorious Revolution later tested loyalties between monarch and parliament when James II fled and William of Orange was invited. This event crystallized an understanding that a monarch's consent depended on parliamentary support and Protestant establishment. Technical processes mattered too. Writs authorizing levies, patents granting offices, and parliamentary rolls that recorded debate became instruments by which power was exercised and limited. At roughly one-third into our narrative, a brief pause is helpful. If this section raised questions or surprises, you are not alone. Many decisions that seemed inevitable were in fact the product of accidents, marriages, and quick choices in council. Share with us in the comments which turning point you think mattered most. Start your comment with "the pivotal moment was," and then name one incident, whether a battle, a marriage, a charter, or a trial, and explain in one sentence why. Your perspective helps others see alternative readings and guides future episodes. We often feature the most thoughtful replies in follow-up videos, and your input can shape which deep dives we take next. Now, with your impressions in mind, we return to the high drama of constitutional crises and the practical work of governance that followed. The later 17th century brought revolutionary experiments and constitutional settlements that redefined sovereignty. The trial of Charles I made accountability a legal concept rather than a rhetorical one. The interregnum that followed showed how committees, councils, and naval boards attempted to fill roles traditionally occupied by the crown. The Restoration reinstated ceremonial monarchy, but left intact new expectations about taxation and representation. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the subsequent Bill of Rights created a constitutional architecture that limited royal prerogative and strengthened parliamentary ascendancy. These were not single acts, but sequences of negotiations, petitions, and legal texts. Clerks in the House of Commons recorded petitions from constituencies, municipal merchants drafted petitions about trade, and legal arguments invoking precedents persuaded judges and MPs alike. The institutionalization of the balance between Crown and Parliament depended on the slow accumulation of practice, not on sudden enlightenment. Consequences of these centuries of hidden work are visible in the modern British polity. Administrative practices such as writs and registers evolved into civil service habits. The idea that law could bind rulers surfaced in petitions, charters, and parliamentary statute, and later informed colonial governance. Cultural shifts followed legal ones. The English language increasingly replaced French in official documents. Religious settlement shaped civic identity, and towns gained self-governing privileges they would defend fiercely. Overseas, the administrative techniques of record-keeping, chartering, and patenting were exported to colonies and shaped imperial governance. Long-term legacies include the formation of parliamentary sovereignty, the centrality of bureaucracy, and the embedding of rights language into public debate. Epilogue. 1 month later. A month after a decisive succession or charter, the immediate landscape changed in concrete ways. Local reeves received writs ordering new oaths. Sheriffs collected rents under revised schedules, and visiting auditors arrived to inspect accounts. In towns such as York and Bristol, merchants recalculated credit ledgers, altering trade lines to accommodate new tariffs or tolls. Noble households adjusted retinues and dismissed servants associated with rival factions. For individuals, the practical impact was clear. A reeve named William of Suffolk might find his salary confirmed in writing, while a tenant named Alice would receive a writ clarifying the terms of her tenancy. Chroniclers such as Matthew Paris recorded rumors and public mood, the cathedral bell often marking both joy and mourning as news traveled. These tangible adjustments show how dynastic shifts translate into everyday administrative acts and measurable change in tax rolls, leases, and legal summons. 3 months later. At the quarter-year mark, the effects consolidated into patterns. Local courts operated under new precedents, and ecclesiastical courts adjusted calendars to reflect changes in patronage. A named actor such as Sir Edward Mortimer might petition the Exchequer for arrears based on new obligations, and the Curia Regis could issue instructions to sheriffs that standardized collection across counties. Political alliances became visible in marriage negotiations and land settlements filed at the county court. Merchants noted new coinage or a change in the mint policy and altered import routes accordingly. In urban councils, debates about charters shifted from rhetorical to procedural as municipal officers demanded formal recognition from crown representatives. The institutional memory of these months mattered. The forms and writs issued now entered registries and would be cited in disputes for generations. 6 months later, half a year on, broader transformations appear. Parliamentary sessions might codify some of the emergency measures introduced earlier, turning provisional arrangements into statutes. The administrative class of clerks, registrars, and auditors expanded to meet the demands of record management. A named institution like the House of Commons could assert a claim to approve taxation based on practices adopted during crisis, and legal practitioners would cite those practices as precedents. Economically, markets adjusted, and we can track shifts in commodity flows and rent rates in surviving account rolls. Culturally, patronage networks reoriented around the new power holders, fostering the emergence of political factions that would shape later politics. The invisible work of governance became visible through measurable outputs: charters issued, laws recorded, offices created, and salaries established. These are the concrete legacies that link private choices to public institutions. As we close, recall that what appears in Chronicles as the drama of kings and queens rests on a substratum of routine labor: clerks drafting writs, treasurers tabulating returns, reeves delivering summons. The hidden lives within palaces and registries often determined whether a crown would survive scandal or collapse. The mechanics of rule, documents, rituals, local officers, matter as much as banners and bloodlines. Understanding those layers explains why England's political evolution followed the path it did and why similar mechanisms shaped polities elsewhere. If this journey through backstairs, chancery rooms, and battlefield mud has shifted your view, subscribe to follow further episodes that dig into specific reigns and the archives that preserve them. History is not only the story of who wore a crown, it is the record of how institutions outlived individuals.